Well, good evening. We're thrilled to have all of you here tonight, and thank you for your patience as we took a few photographs. My name is Marek Zabriskie. I'm privileged to be the rector of this incredible congregation, Christ Church Greenwich, and we're just thrilled to have you here and especially to have David Brooks here tonight. In a world where faith can feel fragmented and pushed aside, this series exists to spark honest conversation, to deepen understanding, and encourage us to live with hope, purpose, and yes, courage. Together with our partners at St. Barnabas Episcopal Church, we continue to explore what it means to follow God's call in an ever-changing and an often divided world. Right after this talk, we hope you'll join us downstairs through these doors and downstairs for a wine and cheese reception and to continue the conversation among those who you've joined in with other friends who are here tonight. Tonight we are honored to have David Brooks with us, who's a household name to almost all of us. David is a columnist for the New York Times and frequent contributor to The Atlantic magazine and a regular commentator on PBS NewsHour. He is one of the most thoughtful voices in American public life. Someone who helps us to see one another with greater clarity, empathy, and respect. His newest New York Times best-selling book, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen, explores the transformative power of truly paying attention to one another. A message that feels especially vital to our church, our nation, and our world today. 6 years ago, a group of us used David's book, The Second Mountain, for a 4-week men's study here at Christ Church that sparked incredible conversation and discussion. It was so rich in meaning and helped us to identify with many parts of our own spiritual journey in life. David has taught at Yale and Duke and now teaches at the University of Chicago. He has received more than 30 honorary degrees and is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. We are grateful for his willingness to be with us, to reflect with us and help us see the world and each other more deeply and with greater compassion and understanding. David will speak for a while, and then we'll have a chance for questions and answers, and then he has to make his way to the airport. But once again, we are thrilled to see you here. Please join me in welcoming David Brooks to Christ Church.
There we go. So it's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful church. Some of you may know I grew up in a Jewish home. And if you saw the movie Fiddler on the Roof, you know how warm and huggy Jewish homes are. Always singing and dancing and laughing. I grew up in the other kind of Jewish home. And so our motto in my household was think Yiddish, act British. And so we were very stiff upper lip. And because of that, my parents sent me to an Episcopalian school called Grace Church School in Lower Manhattan. Some of you may know it near the Strand bookstore. And I was in the choir. And because it was Lower Manhattan, the choir was about 30% Jewish. And so we would sing the hymns, but we wouldn't sing the word Jesus to square with our religion. And so the volume would go down in the church and then come back up again. And because I went to Grace, I spent every summer between age 5 and 23 at a place called the Episcopal Camp and Conference Center in Ivoryton, Connecticut, which is exit 64 on the Turnpike. And so it's good to be back in Connecticut, my favorite state, and it's good to be in Greenwich. When I live in Washington, D.C., it's so good to get outside the Beltway and see the real America. I don't see what people are complaining about. It seems pretty affluent around here, but... So I was in the choir, as I said. I sat in chapel every day looking at that utterly beautiful church. And I grew up with two stories in my head, the Jewish Exodus story and the Christian Jesus story. And I didn't really believe in God, so they were just stories to me. Then around the time I hit 50, we were talking about a friend at Yale Div School named Christian Wyman. And his book, My Bright Abyss, is to me one of the greatest books of Christian apologetics. I highly recommend it. But he writes in there that his old materialistic worldview did not accord with the transcendence of the reality he experienced. And I would say that happened to me. There were just numinous experiences that didn't accord with the materialistic worldview. So I began searching. And I learned that when you begin searching, Christians send you books. And so over the course of a few months, I got about 600 books, only 350 of which were different copies of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And so that became the journey. And my joke is joining the Christian church in 2013 is kind of like investing in the stock market in 1929. My timing could have been better, but it's been wonderful to be back here in this church. And I think my talk today, I hope I'm giving the right talk, is called How America Recovers. Charles de Gaulle began his memoir of World War II with the following sentence: "All my life I've had a certain idea about France. And all my life I've had a certain idea about America." And that America is epitomized by something that happened to me maybe 20 years ago, but it's still vivid in my mind. I was asked to be one of the judges for the Boys and Girls Clubs. And every year they pick a young man or woman, 18 or so, and they name her Boy or Girl of the Year. And the person is supposed to exemplify what Boys and Girls Clubs can do to young people in this country. And we were interviewing the finalists, and this particular young woman had the most wrenching upbringing of abuse, of violence, trauma. And she told us her life story while weeping. And we actually didn't know if we could give her the award, because when you win it, you spend the next year telling your life story. We thought, is this going to re-traumatize her? We decided eventually it's her choice. But then we started asking her about her future. And suddenly her posture changed. And suddenly her eyes lifted. And a huge smile came across her face. A smile that's not only done with the mouth, but the whole body. And she started talking about her dreams and visions and plans for her life. And I could just see this gleam in her eye. Because she didn't know what she was going to do with her life, but she knew it was going to be important. And that fire in her, to me, is what America's all about. The gleam in the eye that says, I'm going to do big things. And sometimes I see it in rich kids at Yale who, the world is their candy store, they want to gobble up all the goodies. Sometimes I see it in poor kids who don't know what they're going to do, but they know they're going to get the hell out of here. And so it's the gleam of social mobility, what we used to call the American dream. I saw it in a book. I read a beautiful memoir by Viola Davis, the actress. And she describes a scene in high school where she was in theater class with all the other drama kids. And the teacher says, how many of you want to be actors? And every hand goes up. And then he says, it's filled with failure. It's filled with setbacks. It's filled with auditions. There's no money for almost everybody in the profession. And most of the hands went down. And she got to the point where Viola Davis's hand was the only hand in the air. And she wrote in the book, I'd been kicked out of homes, I'd had my food cut off, I had my electricity cut off. Somebody telling me life is going to be hard is not a problem for me. My dreams were bigger than my fear. That's the gleam. I once saw Lady Gaga give a speech in New York, And she said of her childhood, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to be extremely brave and show the world what passion looks like. That's the Gleam. And so my whole political philosophy is, how do we create a society in which every kid gets to experience the Gleam? And if you saw the movie Hamilton, about Alexander Hamilton, Hamilton's a personal hero of mine. He's a Puerto Rican hip-hop star from Washington Heights. But that movie, that musical, is all about the Gleam. In New York, you can be a new man. In the room where it happens. I'm not throwing away my shot. Just you wait, just you wait. That's the ambition. And that, to me, is my idea of America. That's not what I see in America today. 70% of Americans say they've given up on the American dream. I'm about to criticize the president, and you should know that about 30% of my friend group are Trump supporters. 2 of my kids are Trump supporters. I made the mistake of sending them to a progressive school. They shifted. So when I'm critical, the one thing I'd say is I found it extremely easy to disagree and dislike, frankly, the president, and love, admire, and have fun with his voters. My common saying is that Trump is the wrong answer to the right question. And the people who voted for him are asking the right questions. But when I see the president, and this was especially true in the first several weeks of the administration, or in moments like the Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office, I experienced that as an assault on my idea of America. Because we're often a dumb country, we're often an arrogant country, we're a naive country, we're an overconfident country, but we rarely seem to be a malevolent country, with some obvious historical exceptions. But I used to go with a guy named Mike Gerson, who was in the Bush administration, to Africa, and the first few trips, we watched people die of HIV. Then Gerson, with Gerson's help, President Bush created this thing called PEPFAR. And we went back, it was like going to the CVS. People just came in, took their drugs, and lived. And when that program got gutted by a Russell vote, I just experienced it as a moral injury. And I've come to think, and this is not just Trump, but I would say global populists around the world. I think it's always a mistake to look at our politics in isolation from the exact same thing that's happening everywhere, at least in the West, and in Latin America too. That the philosophy driving a lot of these people around the world is a kind of anti-philosophy, a kind of amoralism, that morality is for suckers. That in this world, as Thucydides wrote, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And you want to create a world where the norms and the rules and the constitutional restraints are gone so powerful people can do what they want. There's a great 1984 passage that Orwell said. He is an apparatchik in his totalitarian state. He says, you want to know when you have power? It's not when people obey you, because they might be doing that voluntarily. You only know you have power because people are suffering. That's the only way you know. And I've just seen so much cruelty around the world done in the name of populism. And as I say, this is not only a problem for me politically, because it's not the hopeful gleam. It's not looking at the future. Populism's utopia is in the past. And it's not about mobility, it's about threat and protection and security. And these are completely valid political values. Security is important, home is important. But it's not America to me. So how did we get here? Well, it's important to recognize that, as I say, this is A, global, and B, historical. That there's a Trump everywhere. Populism is rising across Western Europe, across Latin America, in Japan, in Asia. This is a historical tide. Very few times in history of the last 200 years have we seen such a strong historical tide. I'd say we've seen a few of them. The first historical tide started with the Enlightenment in the 18th century, And it produced the Democratic Revolution in America, the Democratic Revolution in France, eventually the Democratic Revolutions of 1848. Then in the early part of the 20th century, there was a totalitarian tide, and that produced the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Nazi Party. You had Mussolini, you had totalitarians across the country. Then I'd say in the 1930s, there was a reformist tide, a welfare state tide, which gave us our modern welfare states in almost every country. Then in the 1980s, there was a tide, my personal favorite, of what I call liberalism and what my opponents call neoliberalism. But it was a free market tide, basically. Believed in global trade, global movement of people. I covered the end of the Soviet Union, I saw the tide up close. And that brought us Ronald Reagan, it brought us Margaret Thatcher, in different ways it brought us Mikhail Gorbachev, it brought us Deng Xiaoping. That was a tide. Since 2013, we've had a different tide, and it is this tide of global populism. And so it's very hard to reverse a global tide. Some people say you can fight it, some people say just try to survive it, because the tide shifts. But the source of the tide, in my view, is a loss of faith. It used to be America was exceptional, and I don't mean that better or worse, we were just different. But now we're a very average. Our pessimism is average. 59% of Americans say they believe their country is in decline. That's compared to 58 globally, 59 versus 58. 60% of Americans agree with the system, agree with the statement the system is broken compared to 61% of people around the world. 69% of Americans agree the elites don't get hardworking people. In America, 69%, in the world, 67%. I could go down the list. We're average. We're average. There's a loss of faith all around the world. So what's going on? What's the source? Well, there are some obvious answers, and I think all these stories are somewhat right. Reaction to globalization. Reaction to the information age and what it's doing to societies, rewarding people who have education with money. There's policy failures, the financial crisis, Afghanistan and Iraq. But I think something deeper is going on, something more spiritual. I think we're in the middle of some sort of emotional, psychological, and spiritual crisis. And you can see it in the numbers. You probably know about the rising depression rates, the 30% rise in suicide. You probably know that since 2000, the number of Americans who say they have no close personal friends is up by fourfold. Since 2000, the number of Americans who are not in a romantic relationship is up by a third. Since 2000, the number of people who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50%. 45% of high school students say they're persistently hopeless and despondent. We've just become sadder as a society. And when you become sadder, you become meaner because you perceive yourself being ignored and invisible to society, and you feel threat, and you want to lash out. And I won't give you all the meanness statistics, but gun violence, hate crimes, look at the internet. The one that gets me is it used to be 2/3 of Americans gave to charity. Now under a third, or under 50% give to charity. Just pulled in. Since we're in Greenwich, I can tell this story. I can't tell this story in many places. There's a restaurant in Central Park South called Gabriel's, one of my favorite restaurants in New York. And Gabriel once told me, the owner, you know, you have to throw somebody out of here for being abusive to the staff almost every week. That never used to happen. So abuse comes to Central Park South. We've become an extremely pessimistic country. You can do this thing called Google Ngram to measure the words that are used in every newspaper, every magazine, every printed document. And you can go all the way back to the 1850s. And from 1850 to 2013, Americans use way more positive words than negative valenced words. Even through the Civil War, through World War I, through World War II, 2013, it just plummets. And we use many more negative words than positive words. We've become a much more pessimistic society. In my business, the media, the number of headlines meant to generate anger and fear has doubled since 2000. So there's this loss of faith, this nastiness that we're all surrounded by. So that poses another question. If it's not just policy failure, if it's a deeper spiritual, relational, and emotional failure, where does that come from? So we're going one level down. One of my favorite sayings is from a psychologist named John Bowlby, who was an English guy, I think in the middle of the 20th century. And he was one of the founders of what they call attachment theory, how kids attach to their parents. And one of his sayings is, all of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. You need a secure base. And for most of us, that's our parents, our family, our community, our country, someplace we feel at home. We feel secure. We can be ourselves. We're seen there. But one of the more elusive but important forms of a secure base is to know that you are securely held in a moral order. If we're going to trust each other, trust is faith that you will do what you ought to do. And for me to have that faith in you, or you to have that faith in me, we have to agree on what you ought to do. And we have to have rituals and norms built around what's right and wrong. If two lanes are merging in the highway, it goes right lane, and then the car in the left lane, right lane, left lane. And if you butt in line, I'm going to honk to enforce the norm. In my view, we've lost that secure order. There was a great historian named George Marsden who wrote that what gave such widely compelling force to Martin Luther King's leadership and oratory was his bedrock conviction that moral law was built into the universe. That's what the Bible says. Moral law is built into the universe. That segregation is not just wrong in some places at some times, it's wrong in all places at all times. Slavery is wrong in all places at all times. Rape is wrong in all places at all times. There are goods that are good in all places and time. Mutual respect, belonging, curiosity, wisdom. These things are good in all places and all times. But over the last, really, 70 years, we've been taken a form of liberalism, and by liberal I don't mean left-wing, I mean John Stuart Mill and John Locke. A form of radical individualism has infected our liberalism. And the radical individualism says everything is a matter of choice. You can choose anything. And if you go to commencement speeches, except the ones I give, they tell the people, the students, the graduates, find your own values. Find your own truth. Well, if your name is Aristotle, you can do that. Most of us can't do that. We need a tradition to fall into, to know what's right and wrong. And so when you privatize morality in this way, you've taken away the shared moral order. Way back in 1955, one of the great columnists of all time, a guy named Walter Lippmann, wrote in a book called Essays on Public Philosophy, if what is good, what is right, what is true, is only what the individual chooses to invent, then we are outside the bounds of civilization. And that 1955 sentence, in my view, turned out to be very prescient. That we don't have the security of a shared moral order. So we're all left spiritually naked and alone. And we're left spiritually in a state of flux. I'm going to read a passage. All fixed, fast, frozen relationships with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that's solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. Well, Greenwich, I've just read from the Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Not my usual sources, but they're absolutely right. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned. People feel existential anxiety by not having a shared moral order, not having a shared home, not having a secure base. And as Hannah Arendt wrote many decades ago, existential anxiety always leads to fanaticism. And so to me, that gets closer to what's the root of this spiritual, relational, and emotional crisis. And it should be added that the pain of this crisis are not shared equally. We all know a lot of bifurcations in society. To me, the most important one is between college grads and high school educated grads. The income gaps are vast, but so is all the other gaps. By age 3, children of affluent parents are twice as likely to attend preschool. By 6th grade, children of educated parents are 4 grade levels ahead of children of high school educated parents. By 18, children with educated parents, college educated, have a 1 in 5 chance of scoring over 1,400 on the SATs. Children from high school educated parents, not a 1 in 5 chance, but a 1 in 50 chance. Many of our universities, including the place up the turnpike where I teach, have more kids from the top 2 or 3% families than the bottom 60%. For some reason, we live in a society where you take the kids who do really well in school and we send them to Wash U in St. Louis, a school that spends $350,000 per kid per year. And the kids who do less well at age 17, we send them to community college, which spends $11,000 per kid per year. How did we think this was a good idea? People with high school degrees are 2.4 times more likely to say they have no friends than people with college degrees. Well, if you tell people generation after generation after generation that your kind is going to lose the game and the other kind is going to win, well, they're going to flip the table. And to me, that's populism. So what can we do about it? In my experience, in my view, the turnaround has already happened. Let's think about how lives and nations turn around. When I often ask people, what made you who you are today? And no one has ever said to me, I went on this vacation in Hawaii. It was awesome. That made me the person I am today. Like, no one ever says that. They always talk about some hard time. They always talk about a process of rupture and repair. I went through a hard time in my own life, in the time that was about the time of my coming to faith. I'd had a divorce. My kids were leaving home to go to college. I had realized that I had a lot of work friends, but I had no weekend friends, the kind of people you just hang out with. And so I did what any middle-aged male idiot did, which is I tried to work my way through a problem. Workaholism is a very seductive therapy for an emotional crisis. And the way I symbolize this, which is true, if you'd gone to my apartment in Washington, I wasn't having anybody over. And so if you went to the kitchen and pulled out the drawer where there should have been silverware, there was just Post-it notes. And where there should have been plates, there was stationery. That's how I was working. And so I was in the valley. And I read a book a sermon by Paul Tillich. And he says, moments of suffering interrupt your life and they remind you you're not the person you thought you were. They carve through the floor of the basement of your soul and they reveal a cavity below, and they carve through that floor and reveal a cavity below. You just see, in moments of pain, you see deeper into yourself than you do in happy times. And when you see that deeply in yourself, you realize only spiritual and relational food will fill these holes down there. Then I read a book by a Catholic theologian named Henry Nouwen, and he said, when you're in pain, you have to stay in the pain to see what it has to teach you. I was like, screw that, I want to get out of the pain. And then I read several books by a guy I hope people know in this audience, named Frederick Buechner. And he says when you're in moments of pain, you can either be broken or broken open. And when you're broken by them, you get shriveled up, you close off, you make yourself invulnerable. And when you're broken open, you make yourself even more vulnerable amid the pain. So I decided, I'm going to try to do that. And so one day, around that time, I was invited over to a couple's house named Kathy and David, and they had a kid in the DC public school named Santi. And Santi had a friend named James, whose mom had some health and drug issues. And James often didn't have a place to stay or something to eat. And so Kathy and David said, well, James can stay with us when he needs to. And then James had a friend, and that kid had a friend, and that kid had a friend. And by the time I go over to their house on a Thursday night, there are 40 kids around the dinner table and 15 sleeping or mattresses spread around the house. And so I walk up, meet a kid in the front door. We call them kids, but they were 17. They were all bigger than me. And he said, we're not really allowed to shake hands here. We just hug here. And I am not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth. But I went back to that dinner every Thursday night until COVID, so about 7 years. And they finally outgrew it. I know the kids still, obviously, but they're in their late 20s. And they beamed the attention of love onto you with such vitality, you had no choice but to beam it back. And so for an emotionally, let's say, restrained guy, I had no choice but to open up. And it's like they reached into the valley and pulled me up. Rupture and repair. So that's how it happens in personal life. And now I'm a happy guy, happily married, and I sometimes miss those profound thoughts I had when I was miserable. But not that much, frankly. And so that's the personal process. The national process is actually not all that different. You're in the valley, you see your problems deeper, and you have to make yourself more vulnerable. And you have to fix what you've done wrong. There are plenty of historical examples. There's a guy named Jared Diamond who wrote a book called Upheaval. It's exactly about this, about countries that were in the valley, that had serious problems, and they built themselves back up. Britain in the 1980s, Australia in the 1970s, Germany and Japan after World War II, South Korea in the 1980s, Rwanda after 1994, Chile in the 1990s. And it's happened in this country, not once, not twice, but multiple times in American history. In 2020, in the middle of COVID, I read a book by a Harvard political scientist named Samuel Huntington. I'm quoting famous people today. He was a very famous political scientist. And it was, I forget the title, it's like some boring title, but the subtitle was The Promise of Disharmony. And writing in that book, he says, it's weird, but I noticed this pattern in American history that every 60 years or so, America seems to go through what he called a moral convulsion. And it's a moment when people get disgusted with established power. They want to tear everything down. A passionate generation comes on the scene. There's a new communications technology. These periods are brutal to live through. And he said it happened in the 1770s with the Revolutionary period. The Americans who fought amongst themselves between those who supported Britain and those who supported the Revolution, we forget they were killing each other. Not just the British, Americans were killing Americans. It was brutal. 1830s, the age of populism, Andrew Jackson, Trail of Tears, brutal. 1890s, racial terrorism, massive corruption in politics, waves of poverty. A guy named Jacob Riis wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives a couple years after that. And brutal period to live through. 1960s, assassinations, riots. People forget that in 1969, there were thousands of bombings on American college campuses. And so writing in 1981, which is when he wrote this book, Huntington writes, I don't know if I believe in this theory of every 60 years, like cycles of history, really. But if the pattern holds, sometime around 2020, America will go through another moral convulsion. I was like, well done, Professor Huntington. But the key point he's making, or that we can make, is that people come out of them. The 1830s was a brutal time, but Andrew Jackson screwed up. He destroyed our monetary system and causing the second greatest depression in American history. And his movement was gone. His successor, actually, Martin Van Buren. In the 1890s, and this is an example I'd like to dwell on. As I said, there was political corruption in the cities. There was poverty. There were waves of immigration. There was lynching. horrible period. But by 1910, America was in a much better place. What happened? Well, three things happened in this order. First, there was a cultural shift. In the 1870s, the dominant culture was defined by the social Darwin movement, social Darwinism, which held dog eat dog, people are poor because they're lazy. By the 1890s, there had been a new thing come along called the social gospel movement, which was more communal. People are poor because of systems. So there was a cultural shift from an individualistic culture to a more communal culture. Then around the 1890s, you had a civic renaissance. All sorts of organizations that we now know today were founded in that era. The Boys and Girls Clubs, which I mentioned, the Sierra Club, the NAACP, the unions, the temperance movement, movement after movement. And there were groups of people who understood that America's civic structures had been designed to educate and raise kids on the prairies of Kansas. But suddenly there were 1 million kids in Baltimore, 1 million kids in Chicago, 1 million kids in New York. This urban poverty had to be dealt with. And people like Jane Addams had the settlement house movement in Chicago, to address this problem. So you had a cultural shift, a civic renaissance, and then eventually you get the progressive movement, which is people like Theodore Roosevelt and even Woodrow Wilson, who give us the Food and Drug Administration, the National Forest Service, eventually the Federal Reserve System. So the shift went cultural, civic, political. And another time in history when this happened, I won't go into such detail, is Britain in the first half of the 19th century. And the pattern was the same. Cultural, civic, political. Now, how can we get this thing started? Well, we need a cultural shift. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But I'll just close by reminding you that citizens have power. In the Philippines, a guy named Ferdinand Marcos, some of you may remember, tried to centralize power. So what happened? The students rose up. The transit workers rose up. The Catholic Church rose up. And they grabbed back power from Marcos, and eventually the Reagan administration threatened a full foreign aid, and he was gone. These uprisings, these mass movements are not rare. There's a book called Why Civil Resistance Works. Two authors looked at 323 resistance movements, and a lot of them work. And nonviolent resistance movements work twice as frequently as violent ones, by the way. And so, to me, we're beginning that. We had the No Kings rallies, but we've still got too much passivity, especially among the elites, among business leaders, among university presidents, among many law firms. Their attitude is, if I step out, put my head above the parapets, my organization will lose millions of dollars or billions. The second problem is a lot of people still don't understand the problem. It's a historical tide, as I said. You can't beat a historical tide with a tax credit. You have to create a counter tide. Look at what MAGA offers people. I see it in my own family. MAGA is culture. He offers people a sense of belonging, an identity, status, self-respect, a comprehensive political ethic. He offers a religion. If you saw the Charlie Kirk Memorial, the politics and the religion are all intermingled there. And Democrats think Chuck Schumer's the response, with all respect to Chuck Schumer. And so we got to have a historical tide that requires thinkers. Donald Trump is not necessarily the most intellectual guy on the face of the earth. But MAGA traces its intellectual roots back to the Know Nothing movement, back to America First movement, but to thinkers. Names you may have heard of or may not have heard of. Albert J. Nock, James Burnham, Sam Francis, Pat Buchanan, Christopher Lasch. Christopher Lasch wrote a book in 1995 called The Revolt of the Elites. It was how the elites betrayed America. And there's almost nothing J.D. Vance has said in the last 5 or 10 years that is not in Christopher Lasch's book. I had a research assistant at the Times named James. And one day, about 10 years ago, I go down to James's office, and I see he's reading Christopher Lasch's book. At that time, the book was only 20 years old, but it was still weird to see a 21-year-old kid reading this 20-year-old work of social criticism. And I thought, what the hell is James reading that book for? Well, James is now J.D. Vance's speechwriter. He read the ideas and said, yeah, this appeals right to me. So you got to beat ideas with ideas. And so far, the Democrats, it's not about messaging. It's not about finding the right candidate. You've got to have an intellectual, you've got to have activists, you can have rallies and marches and all you want, but if you don't have vision, if you don't have a value system, then it's not going to go anywhere. And so to me, we're still in the value system part of the business. And the rallies are great, I'm all for them. But that's not what's going to create a reverse historical tide. Now, the weakness of MAGA, especially in this country, that gleam, the American dream, the idea that the future is what unites us, that's not the story Donald Trump tells you. He tells the following story. The good, common people of America are being threatened by the cosmopolitans and the outsiders and the foreigners. You know whose story that is? That's the Russian story. That's not only Putin, but that's the Russian story going back centuries. So in my view, his greatest weakness is he tells a story that is at odds with America's cultural DNA. And somehow we have to renegotiate America's story so people recover what's deep inside them. Believe me, it's still there. If you ask people, I saw a study, what is it, do you want more diversity in society or less? Huge majorities want more diversity. Are immigrants good for America or bad? Huge majorities say immigrants are great for America. Do you want America to champion democracy around the world? Huge majorities say this, yes. If you ask people what makes an American, it's about work, it's about mobility, what I've been describing. What's at the bottom of the ranking when you ask people? Christian, being a Christian. People don't think that's essential to being American. So the beliefs, the people are still there in their core values, but they have not been talked to. And they have not seen a political party, frankly the Democratic Party, that does that. Social movements create a soap opera every day. They create an action that tells a story. The bus boycotts, the sit-ins. Those were actions that told a story every day. Those were actions that ramped up the tension. And they put the segregationists in a no-win situation. Their choice was to give up the streets to the people who were marching or to crack down on them in a violent manner and look like monsters themselves. That's the kind of lose-lose situation you want to put people in. And so as I say, this can happen. And I'm confident it will. It's happened so many times in American history that we've come back. I just think we're in the process, but we need to go through the steps. And so I'll close with a story about my life. I travel a lot. And one night, about 2 months after October 7th, I was in a bar in a hotel. And if you'd seen me, you would have thought, sad guy drinking alone. But I call it reporting. And I'm scrolling through Twitter, and you can imagine, it's a couple months after October 7th. It was just images from the Middle East, and they were all brutal. And just scrolling, doom, doom, doom. And I come across a video, and it was a black and white video, looked like it was made in the early 60s based on the quality. And in it, James Baldwin, the novelist, is being interviewed. And he says to the interviewer, it's a short clip, obviously, there's not as much humanity as one would like to see. But there's enough. There's more than you would think. And he then goes on to say, what you've got to remember is when you walk down the street, every person you see could be you. You could be that person, and that person could be you. You could be that wonderful person, you could be that monster. And you've got to decide who you want to be. And so I saw this video, and James Baldwin had every right to be bitter about humanity in America. And often, frankly, in his writing, he was angry and bitter. But he was still able to make this most humanistic of statements. that every person, you could be that person could be you. That's the essential human connection. And the phrase that leapt out of me as I'm sitting there on my phone was defiant humanism. That even in the case of a hailstorm of mistreatment, he was defiantly humanistic. And it seems to me that's what we're called upon to be today. Thanks very much.
David's kind enough to be willing to take about 15 minutes of questions. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to speak into the microphone if you can, and to ask a simple one-sentence question, just so we can get around a little bit. We've got a question over here.
David, thank you very much first. And I totally agree with you about the leadership of any movement at this point in time is just not right. I've been to 2 No Kings rallies in DC and things like that. It's just not happening. Will you please stick your neck out too, along with all of us? We will all march with you. Will you please start getting the movement going down the right path? The right path now is the return of democracy, the return of humanity. Everybody knows that this current administration is made up of people who are basically mendacious, and I agree that the selling point now may be humanity. Can you help lead that? I'll march next to you. Okay. I'll march all the way down Pennsylvania Avenue.
Thank you. I've written articles about movement, which is the lamest answer it's possible to give, calling for this in the Times and the Atlantic. But I'm not particularly a movement guy. But I don't have the charisma to lead one. I don't have what leaders really need. I do my lane is writing and advocating, so I advocate. But I have gotten to the point. We're in such a state where, remember, I'm a more center right than center left. But now I'm reading all these super lefty social activist types, Saul Alinsky. I'm like going, yeah, let's do this. So I would march, but I just think my lane is writing and talking. That's what I do. And we need all kinds.
Mr. Brooks, thank you so much for being here. How would you explain churchgoers who support, even here in Christchurch, who support Trump and Project 2025? Thank you.
Yeah. So, as I say, I mean, the shortest answer to me is that a lot of people support President Trump because they feel that the top 20% of the country has dominated the political power, dominated the cultural power, dominated the economic power of the society, and it's wrong. And so I often ask Trump supporters, how'd you come to think this? I never ask people, what do you believe? I ask them, how'd you come to think this? And there's never a moment, they start telling me about an experience they had, about values they had, about a moment they were red-pilled where they were offended by the left and by the occasional smugness and arrogance of the left. And they said, hell with those people. And I'm sure that happens in Greenwich as much as anywhere else. And so there's a lot of people who have just been driven away by the left. And I work at Yale, I work at the New York Times, I work at PBS. There are moments when I think that way. Screw them, they're so arrogant, they're so smug. That's why 2 of my kids, who went to this fancy private day school, they're not the kind of MAGA people who would go to MAGA rally, they'd never be caught dead. My son reads Oswald Spengler and Kant. But they think he's basically a force for good. And then the second thing, specifically within the Christian faith. There are a lot of people who feel that faith in America is under siege. The siege mentality is a very powerful mentality. And their attitude is, we're in a war, they're trying to destroy us, we need a jerk on our side. And again, I don't agree. I don't think, I once, in the very beginning of this, I was at the Republican Convention in 2016, and I met with some Christian leaders who were supporting Trump. I was like, which of the Christian virtues does Donald Trump embody? Is he living a Christological life? I don't really think so. And they didn't try to defend. They just, a lot of them were motivated by Obergefell, the decision that legalized gay marriage. A lot of them were motivated by abortion. A lot of them just think that Christians should be allowed to speak their faith aloud without being condescended to or judged or rejected. And a lot of people feel invisible and unseen, and Donald Trump said, I see you. Respect is also a very powerful mentality. And so, again, I don't, as you can tell, I'm not a fan of the administration. I think it's awful in some ways. But I'm really not a harsh critic of the people who support him, because I think they have a story to tell. Most of the people, I should say. Some of the people I'm critical of.
Good evening, Mr. Brooks. I left you a note at your book table. I hope we can connect. Is our reckoning as our country kind of digging into the foundation, digging the hole, is us to come to grips with COVID and January 6th, this whole idea of, economy out of whack, people feeling their liberties were taken away, that the whole system just didn't work? Is that what needs to happen in 26 and 28 and moving forward, or is everybody too afraid to reckon with it?
Yeah, I think that I read some numbers about the loss of faith in the system and the loss of faith and expertise. And I think that loss of faith and the sense of cynicism, the game is rigged, that's very prevalent. I have a friend of mine who's a Trump supporter, and I was saying something on TV nice about institutions, how I really treasure institutions. I went to a great school, I went to a great summer camp, I went to a great university. And he said, can we have a Zoom about that? Because I've never had an institution that was anything but a jackboot in my face. And he told me about what his high school was like, what his employer was like. And so he had a much harsher life experience. And he supports the president as a result. And so I read a piece today by a Bulgarian intellectual whose name I've now forgotten. But he said something, there was a sentence in the piece. When he was asking, all around the world, people opposing the populists have said, they're authoritarians, they're a threat to democracy. Why hasn't it worked? And he says it's because people who are populists may be a threat to democracy, but they all claim to be the protectors of democracy. So the message is muddied. But then he had a sentence that our problem is not a housing crisis, it's a home crisis. People don't feel their country is their home anymore, a lot of people. And that's not only an American problem, that's even more so a European problem. And when you say, feel at home, what does that mean? It means relax. You're seen here, you're comfortable here, you can joke around here. Nobody's going to judge you here. A lot of people feel they have no home, and I think that's true of an actual home. Their family structure is fragile. It's true of a communal home, it's true of a spiritual home, it's true of a national home. And until the Democrats can speak the language of home, and frankly, one of my frustrations with the Democratic Party, which I grew up rooting for and then was rooting against, now I'm rooting for again. There's a great philosopher named Isaiah Berlin who said, I'm happy to be on the rightward edge of the leftward tendency, which is where I find myself. Democrats are overly focused on economics. Economics is important. Giving people benefits is important. But in my view, Democrats are not as adept as Republicans at talking the language of culture. And they need to learn to talk in that language, because that's really the core here more than economics, frankly. I don't know how I wandered into that, but I see Marek way in the back there.
Hi, David, thank you so much for being here. I asked this, quite frankly, as a Reagan conservative, so I cannot stand what's happening with Trump, but here's my question to you. After Trump leaves office and his nonstop lying can stop, do you think that the MAGA movement can continue because nobody can MAGA like Trump does? Nobody can continually lie in every second of what he says like he can.
Yeah, he's a very deft political figure. He's a manipulator. One of the things about narcissists is they're fantastic at manipulating because all their life they've been unable to understand what's going on in somebody else's brain. And so they have to manipulate them in order to predict their behavior. He's been doing this his whole life. And narcissistic personality disorder is not something that you get cured of. I was going to make a hedge fund joke, but then we're in Greenwich. I once was at a neurosurgeon conference, and instead of the word neurosurgeon, I kept saying narcissist. And it was a slip of the mind, but they all thought it was accurate. So I guess my answer, though, is that after Trump is off stage, and I was glad to see him acknowledge that there is a 2-term limit, I don't think the Republican Party is ever going back to the Reagan era, the free market era. I mean, I was working at the Wall Street Journal editorial page in those days. It was good days for me. But Steve Forbes is not coming back. And that's because I just look around the world, and every right-wing party around the world has had the exact same thing happen to it. It's become a working-class party. And every center-left party around the world has become an educated class party. And when you look at a lot of the parties in Poland, Latin America, a lot of the parties where the populists lost, they lost for a little while and then they came back. And in some of the countries where the center-left has won, they're pummeled. Keir Starmer in the United Kingdom, his prime ministership is basically over. People have given up on him, and the Tory party is coming in 3rd or 4th, and the dominant party in the UK is the Reform Party led by Nigel Farage, which is even more populist than Boris Johnson ever was. And so to me, this is just a structural shift, and it's caused by basically the nature of our society. When we were an industrial society, there were unions, there were workers, and there was capital. And in every Western democracy, capital was generally on the right, and unions were generally on the left. But now we're in an information age economy, not an industrial economy, and where education and money go together, center-left is always the educated, and the right is the worker. So you're younger than me, and I have friends who are conservatives who want to save the Republican Party. They were more Reagan types. And they ask should I be doing this? And I say to them, if you're under 45, that's absolutely what you should be doing. We need 2 healthy parties. But I'm way over 45, not in my lifetime. I think that's basically it. We may get a more responsible version, by the way. Like I mentioned all those statistics about how the high school educated are lagging so far behind, dying 10 years earlier. If the Republican Party said, you working class voters, you're our voters, we are going to orient ourselves toward you and making your life better. We're going to heal the health disparities. We're going to heal the education disparities. We're going to heal the family structure disparities. I'd be for that all day. But is Donald Trump doing any of that? No. How does defunding PBS help the working class? How does going after Harvard help the working class? What the administration is a bunch of educated Ivy League elites attacking other Ivy League elites. And, that's a game I'd rather sit out.
Thank you for being here tonight. We so appreciate it. I just wanted to ask you if there's any Democratic Party person that you would support and that you would throw your support for them Is there any emerging person coming to your mind?
Yeah, a ton.
Is there? Can you share
Sure.
what
Josh
some of those
Shapiro
might be?
from Pennsylvania, Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota, the normies. That's because I'm an old normie. But frankly, if I was given a vote, I really shouldn't say this because I really don't talk about who I would vote, but I'll say someone who's impressed me. Frankly, it's Rahm Emanuel, the former mayor of Chicago. And here's the reason why. One of the things that's happened over the last 10 years, since COVID, before COVID actually, is that schools in blue states have gotten worse and worse, and schools in red states have gotten better and better. They call it the Southern Surge. So the most successful school systems in our country are now in Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, and Florida. And if you look, after you control for demographics, who's producing the best outcomes? It's all red states at the top, it's all blue states at the bottom. Connecticut and Massachusetts used to be the kings of education. Not anymore. Here's one statistic, which I just happened to come across. In Mississippi, the number of black 8th graders who are reading at grade level is 58%. In California, a much richer state, it's 28%. How did that come about? And in part it was COVID, but this trend happened long before COVID. And in my view, the Democratic Party, which had Bill Clinton and Barack Obama as education presidents, sort of lost interest in education. Joe Biden was married to a teacher. Did he have an education policy? Kamala Harris, where there should have been an education plank in her platform, zippo. And I think the Democrats have basically decided we can't alienate any member of our party. We have to prove coherence. So we can't do anything that the unions might not like, or anything the reform movement might not like. And so forth, they're out of the game. And I talked about that gleam. If schools decline, then kids don't have the gleam because they don't have the opportunity in front of them. And Rahm Emanuel, as mayor of Chicago, had a wonderful record on education, the data show. And he's going around the country and his proto-campaign, and he's talking about education. And so because of my political orientation, more progressive people than me believe in equality. More libertarian people than me believe in freedom as their highest political value. I believe in mobility, as you can tell. And at least Rahm's talking about the schools. And that would be a good place to restore faith in the American dream.
I'd like to ask just a final question, and then the Reverend Justin Crisp is going to just say a prayer, and we're going to let you get off to the airport, and we'll begin the reception. But we have people from all sorts of different faith communities here in Greenwich and beyond. What can the faith communities be doing at this time? In your book, The Second Mountain, you talk about weaving thick community. We've made that really the heart of what we're doing here. And also we know we have such a divided country. How can we play an important role despite whatever our faith communities are? What would you recommend we be doing at this time?
Yeah. First, when I hear pastors talk, or rabbis or imams talk about politics, I'm always like, why are you lowering yourself to my level? And so I would like to see a couple things. One, I have a friend who's a pastor who says it used to be people didn't believe in our faith because they just didn't believe in our faith. Now they don't believe we believe in our faith. And so be Christian, be Jewish, be Muslim. Second, and to me what the faith is a lot of things, obviously. But one of the things, there's a guy named Dallas Willard who wrote a book, The Transformation of the Heart. It's about transforming souls and hearts. And here's one thing I know for sure about America. This is the most spiritually hungry society, I don't know, maybe ever. When I teach at Yale, I teach moral formation. When I write books, my books are moral formation. People are hungry for that because it used to be moral formation, the cultivation of souls, used to be everywhere in society. It was in churches, it was in schools, it was in unions. We got out of the moral formation business and we got into the career business. And so what I would love to see is churches, and especially church leaders, doing what not long ago Reinhold Niebuhr did, what Abraham Joshua Heschel did, what Fulton Sheen did. They were spiritual presences on the national stage. And what I would love to see churches doing is answering and asking the basic question of their lives, which is, what is a human being? What is a soul? Who are you when work goes away? What is right and what is wrong? And let's discuss this. And I tell you, there's great hunger we have a morally inarticulate country because we privatized morality. And when I was teaching at Yale, I taught a course in humility. I thought it'd be funny to have a New York Times teaching Yale kids about humility. I was going to write a book on the subject. It was going to say humility, and then in big letters, David Brooks. And students were lining up to get into this kind of course because they're hungry. And then at the end of the course, one of my best students said, Professor Brooks, I just wanted to tell you that this course has made me a lot sadder. And I was like, yes. Because he'd aced everything. He became a Rhodes Scholar. He's a great student. But this, he had not aced. And he knew he had work to do. And that's a rewarding moment. But people in a lot of churches feel besieged and the secularism is taken over. I just say, be not afraid, because you have what the world is hungering for, and all you have to do is offer the food, the drink that makes thirst go away. And by the way, this is already happening. If you look at who's going back to church, especially Europe, but even here, I've now been convinced, it's alienated young men. They're going back. They're going back to the hardcore churches. They're going back to the Orthodox churches. They're going back to the most conservative Catholic churches. I think they like the Orthodox because they got big beards. But so that's what I would love to see. Just a public witness and a presence on the stage, not about tax cuts, but about affairs of the heart and soul. Thank you.
Will you join me in thanking David Brooks?
Thank you.
Mr. Brooks, I have had such admiration for you for such a long time for so many reasons, one of which is the devotion which you put on display tonight to understanding the motivations, the arguments, the heart, the crises, the despair potentially of those with whom you disagree politically and otherwise. It is one of your gifts. And as we go out from this place to address, encourage, and faith the spiritual crisis which you have laid out for us, I want to offer a prayer from our tradition at Christ Church and at St. Barnabas, from the Episcopal tradition in that spirit. Let us pray. O God, you have made us in your own image and redeemed us through Jesus, your Son. Look with compassion on the whole human family. Take away the arrogance and hatred which infect our hearts. Break down the walls that separate us and unite us in your bonds of love. And work through our struggle and our confusion to accomplish your purposes on earth, that in your good time we might all serve you in harmony around your heavenly throne, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. This has been Courage and Faith. Please join me in thanking David Brooks one last time.